Warning: the book we're about to talk about may contain tears.
And on that somber note, welcome to this week's episode of the 800s. I am your co host, Alex, and Adam is out today, so he will be abstaining from this book for reasons we'll get into later. Uh, so, co hosting with me today is the man who's usually behind the screen, Alan, who's running tech as well as hosting today. Thank you for double dipping.
Yo, no
And with
problem.
that, let's just get right into the plugs.
All right. Let's see. Plugs. Yeah, so, uh, if you're watching this and you can't stay for the whole show, you can go check us out on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel called The DM's Table. And if you want to join along in the conversation uh, during this on YouTube or wherever, go ahead and throw your comments in the chat, and we'll interact with you and get your insights and stuff like that. Go check out Audible if you enjoy listening to your books instead of reading them, or if you just have a busy lifestyle. Audible is a fantastic platform. You get all sorts of different options. They have thousands and thousands of books to choose from, and I believe when you sign up, you get 2 books free, which is pretty cool. So go check out Audible today. You can go to dmstable.com/audible, and that'll take you right over to our affiliate uh, link. Um, do. Also, if you were listening at the start of the show, you were listening to Incompetech. Uh, Incompetech's Fearless First. You can check out more information on Incompetech at incompetech.filmmusic.io. Fantastic library. We've used them for forever, including on our podcast. Uh, if you want to help us keep the lights on, go check out our Patreon at patreon.com/dmstable. Over there, we host our book votes, and becoming a patron usually gets you access to voting on the books, except for select months, we open it up for everybody. Also, there's fun stuff coming, like digital art only for our patrons, and access to all sorts of exclusive content through that. So go check out our Patreon, patreon.com/dmstable. And finally, if you want to check out our really cool nerdy wares, go check out our Etsy page, etsy.com/dmstable. Um, or or you can go to dmstable.com/etsy. Sorry. And there you can find the new sign that I've been developing. I have completed it, and we are now selling it. It came out this week, so super excited, super excited. So go check that out. And I believe that's all the plugs. So Alex, tell them about the book.
All right, so this week on the 800s, we'll be discussing the novel How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. The
Ooh, well
sci-fi
done.
tale. Thank you. This sci-fi tale begins in the melting Siberian tundra, where a grieving archaeologist and father, Cliff Miyashiro, has come to continue his daughter's work after her sudden passing. Meanwhile, thanks to climate change, a team of international scientists are working together to solve the mysteries frozen for millennia in the permafrost, including ancient markings, flora, fauna, and even diseases. Cliff is there to examine a girl preserved in the ice, and in this girl is a connection to his present grief, secrets of the past, and a devastating future for all of humanity. We'll have to just wait and see just how high we can go in the dark to come.
Yeah. So, how the 800s works, if you're new to the channel, is we are a Twitch book club. So, I mean, like every good book club, we thrive on conversation. It's going to be on Alex and I to kind of start that conversation, but we love to see chat uh, join in. That's going to make the show more enjoyable for everybody. It'll be much more interesting to see everybody's point of view. So feel free to ask questions or put comments down in the chat. That'd be um, that's fantastic. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's it.
And as always, and especially for this book, we do cover adult topics and content, so bring kids around at your own risk. This is a show for adults. Trigger warnings. We don't really have a good system for setting them up beforehand, but we will try to let you know that there are trigger warnings for trauma, particularly for parents and those who have lost kids in this one, as well as other types of violence. So uh, please be careful with who you introduce to this stuff, but we will try to let people know beforehand, both for the chat and for anybody watching in the future.
Yeah.
Um, Also, we're trying to build a fun and supportive community over here at DM's Table, one where people don't have to feel judged or like they can't share their interests with anything less than the fullest of their enthusiasm. So, in short, be nice or fuck off.
Yes, got him.
Got him.
Oh man. Um. So, wow. Uh, I guess let's start off with first impressions on this guy.
All
Uh,
right.
Go ahead, Alex. What were your first impressions?
So, my very first impressions was this was it seemed like it was going to start off like a pretty standard sci-fi cut to like before the inevitable massive change to the world, like basically like a either a flashback or like here's what happened before the world went to before the world went to ruin or changed inexorably.
Mm-hmm.
And then it took a hard left turn. Oh boy. Um, and it set itself up to be a pretty typical sci-fi story, and then it seemed like the post-apocalyptic background and stuff, the post-apocalyptic nature of it became less of a driving force in the book and more of like a background setting
Yeah.
for these character-driven stories.
Yeah. Almost
And
almost like that is like the catalyst for these characters, right?
yeah,
It's the thing that's driving them into this weaved network for sure.
yeah, I'm definitely with Ace Goodall because I definitely was just like, oh boy, I wonder what they're gonna find, and like there's little clues to a bunch of different things. Like they were very clearly hinting at the ancient aliens things with like the carvings seem to be etched in laser precision, which was not at all possible with technology from then, and you kind of get set up like anytime in a sci-fi novel that there's people messing around with a disease, it's going to get out or fuck or something, something's going to happen with it. um, but what I didn't expect was it to just kind of fade into the background. Like, yeah, it was very present. I mean, the whole nature of the park was because kids are getting sick and they were trying to figure it out, but it was more about these, yeah, like how humans deal with sadness and loss in tragic times with a subtle hint of fuck capitalism, because like started commodifying death.
Only subtle.
um so like I said, it was very unique in that it moved such a primary thing slightly into the background rather than into the forefront.
Mhm.
And instead we get these really powerful character driven stories and society like social driven stories that, as A Skill said, that they felt like it was too much to handle. And I can understand from the standpoint of, particularly, I imagine for parents, I'm not one myself, you would probably be able to speak to this better, but that is, it was tough for me to go through, and I don't even have kids. And so what did you think for your first impressions
Yeah.
then?
So, funny enough, I so one of the things I try to do for the 800s is I don't look at anything about this like book. So I didn't know it was gonna be sci-fi. I just was like I so the sci-fi thing near like the end um it kind of like caught me off guard, right? So, but anyways, I I felt that like this this book set a tone very early on, and that tone was like set in like loss and grief and sadness mixed with humanity, right? Like like the human emotion. And so I had a hard time with the sadness and grief part of it, but I could appreciate the writing of the humanity aspect. And it does get better, but damn, there's a hump at in chapter 2. Like,
Yeah.
man. So,
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I completely agree. Like the exploration of the human condition and the way that this was emotionally written. I don't think it's the most. I didn't think it was the most accessible prose we've ever read, but honestly, it was incredibly poetic in the way that it was written.
yeah.
Um, so like to me, I like that, but I also know that that might be off-putting to some people. But to that point, it did make things like sadness and loss, like that's what poetry does, is it lends itself to emotion, and that's part of what made the sadness and loss so poignant and tough to get through, especially given the nature of what was being discussed. And I think he did such a sorry, Sequoia did such a good job of drawing us into that. I don't want to get too much into some of these details because I'd like to discuss them as their own topics, but um, to that end, did you have any questions? Otherwise, I've got a few lined up.
You can go ahead. I got a
Okay.
handful queued up too.
Um, so I think then what I wanted to start off with was, what story line through this entire book drew you in the most?
Ooh. I really like the Yamamoto story, the ship. That part was really interesting to me. Um, I enjoyed what I enjoyed about it was like there was a very large sense of hope in that chapter. It was just so profound, and the starting of a new life, which I think these humans needed by that time, right? There had been so much loss that it made sense to start over. And I think that's the one that really drew me in. I had a couple others that were close, but that was the one that was like that really spoke to me. It was sad, right? It was just because it was hopeful doesn't mean that there wasn't sadness. The fact that by the time they finish their travels. It's like 4,000 years into the future or something like that. It was something nuts.
Mhm.
And once you get that far away from Earth, time relativity really fucks you over. So like it was just, I don't know. It was cool. It was the one that sucked me in. How about you?
Well, the same. Honestly, that was the big one for me. Was this idea that, but I want to focus on like a different portion of it, and that's on that back end. Is that bittersweetness of finding what they did and realizing that they didn't have to leave to make it through, but at the same time realizing it was the right decision.
Hmm.
Because there's no guarantees that that would have happened. And this idea that yes, we left the world we knew behind, but we have this new life we can start, and that's okay. And that it provides hope in a weird way. Is that in that Jurassic Park life finds a way type of feel, while also partially relying on the ingenuity of humanity itself rather than just you know in different ways, I guess, because it was still humanity's ingenuity that allowed them to. Well, technically, it wasn't.
It wasn't, but it
It
was.
wasn't. But like this idea that there are multiple ways to make a life out of those situations, and that I really liked this idea that that was like a business that was built around death eventually became like the main means for cultivating a new world to live in, uh, in that we aren't necessarily bound to these death spirals with whether it's economically, biologically, or uh, astronomically, or slash geologically, I guess. uh, it's it was a really good juxtaposition to pretty much the entire rest of the book, while still keeping that somber note of, well, now we are two distinct branches of humanity, and we'll see if we meet somewhere in the middle, and if or how we will is up to who knows what. And there is apparently one who knows what, um, which we'll get to late in a bit. But yeah, I have to agree. Specifically the spaceship and the fact that it made its way, or that like humanity made its way through this in multiple different ways, was pretty fun to read about.
Do you have a do you have a close second?
Um, I thought that like the probably the close second was a bit of a weird one for me.
Hmm.
Um, was I forget the character's name because there were so many characters in this, but the character who was the brother of the guy who actually
The
figured
ship.
out the ship,
Hmm.
was the one who he worked at the death hotels, and
Yeah, Dennis.
Dennis, that's the one.
I got I got a whole list of everything. Just a heads
Awesome.
up.
Um, I liked that one for its ability to talk about how certain things, even in the midst of like how like life wasn't entirely different despite so many shitty circumstances, um, without also being in the pits of despair, like at um,
Yeah.
the theme park. Um,
Yeah.
but like the fact that family dynamics and the stuff that we get hung up on the day to day, that doesn't go away just because there's an apocalypse. It's just, or that like there's a sudden shift in how humanity does things. and that there is a means for change and reconciliation and personal growth even in the midst of what was effectively potentially Armageddon, essentially, and the way the dynamics are written between the different characters, I thought it was really well written. The characters were easy to connect to, and I think that Sequoia also did a really good job of focusing on a perspective that I would know nothing about otherwise, and that is an Asian perspective,
Sure.
um, which is my other close second, and that is the guy who fixes the robots,
Oh yeah,
the,
that's a good one
the, the
too.
robot dogs.
Yeah.
Um, is for the same reason. The dynamic between him and his, goth son, but like this enduring idea that I just want to give people hope, even if it's misguided sometimes. Like this enduring kindness, and like all he wants to do is bring joy to people in even the smallest ways and keep people that they loved alive as much as he can. And again, doing it in the context of a perspective that I would, know nothing about, was really interesting to see how that played out. And it shows how similar we are while also showing very unique, culturally driven differences. And, so those are my two favorites for the same reason, but two very different aspects. One's a bit more negative, one's a bit more positive, but, still,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, Skittles was saying that he found the uh, prose of the book interesting, that the narration felt like internal thoughts. What did you kind of think of the prose here, other than like the poetry? How would you classify the prose as far as like a, I don't know, like a literary, in a literary way? Like, do you feel like they
um,
were overdeveloped? Were they polished? Was it lackluster? Where were you on that?
I again, I think it was, when I say it was poetic, I think that was intentional. I don't think it was like just a thing that came out. I think it was very intentional, especially when the author starts speaking about, um, different characters mentioning poetry that they have uh, attached themselves to, and there's a lot of quoting different poets or writers that are known to have a poetic prose, and I think that was again very intentional, and I think it's going to go over the heads of a lot of people who want something a little more grounded.
Hmm.
um
Grounded,
but
grounded in what way? Are you saying like simpler?
I think casual is
Casual? Okay.
more,
Okay.
like grounded in, like it didn't feel like a conversation. Like Asko said, it felt a lot more like a poetic internal dialogue, like the
Sure.
way somebody might put their thoughts down in a journal, but having specifically done it in a poetic way, rather, because either that's the way that they think or that helps them sort their thoughts, whatever the case may be. But it didn't feel conversational,
Sure.
by any means.
Hmm.
But I think that serves this particular type of story well. Um,
Absolutely.
because you are trying he's like the author is trying to bring us through a number of very heady, and profound concepts that I think the artistic nature of the way the prose was written kind of lets you sink into the weightiness of it all, and for better or for worse, obviously. But uh, I enjoyed it though, and the thing about prose is that it is fairly subjective. You can't just say that was bad or good unless it's just straight up bad writing.
Right.
And this was good writing in a way that was a bit elevated, for the emotional poignancy.
Hmm. I would
It felt intentional.
I would say that like the prose wasn't my jam, but the writing was exceptional. Like it felt like I constantly told my wife like this is certainly a book that will win awards because it
Mhm.
just has that like writing style. It's very I don't know, you know, like you were saying like it's not casual, right? So it takes itself seriously, um, and it is just exceptionally well written. It
Yeah.
it wasn't quite my jam. I know, especially if I would have read it instead of listened to it, I would have had a really hard time getting through it. Mainly because of just the flow of dialogue is not what interests me in this book. And so listening to it, I was able to overcome that flow of dialogue, and I feel like to some degree I was able to kind of shut the world out a little more, you know, because I had noise coming in and just kind of it's like listening to music, right? You kind of shut the world out, which I think allowed me to kind of think more about what I was listening to. I found myself a lot of times like just sitting like at the table, like doing nothing and just listening to the book and trying to sort through like how I felt, right? Like
Mhm.
cuz it's just so heavy that like I really needed time to figure out like how did I actually feel. And so, yeah. I
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really good point though, like listening to music is um I found myself comparing the prose specifically to the way certain music affect like scores affect a movie.
Oh, sure.
The one that came to mind specifically was Interstellar.
Mhm.
You know, heavy concepts, but like what really lent it a lot of profundity was the music. And I think the prose is meant to do something similar. I think it did exactly what it was supposed to, and it made you think, what did I actually feel about this as you were going through it? Because I was doing the exact same thing. Not necessarily even chapter to chapter, but sometimes like sentence to sentence, really. And but you saying like it's not the way that you would have like it's not something that you would have done very well with if you had been reading it outright is exactly what I mean by I think this would go over a lot of people where it would just go over their heads and just be more than they want to take on.
Yeah.
Um, but for those who are willing to go through it, I think you're very right. This is like good, very good writing
Yeah. So
in a
something
way that is not always the most accessible.
yeah. So something that like we try not to talk about on the show, but I wanted to point out was the voice actors for the narration for this book
Hmm.
was that several times I caught the voice actors sounding like they were crying in the booth. And
Hmm.
I was like I'm right there with you, man. like
Well,
like this had to have been such a hard book for voice actors to do because it is a tough book.
and I was actually going to bring that as a topic, maybe towards the end,
Sure.
but since we brought it up now, we might as well just get into it.
Go
Is
for it.
I thought it was amazing that they actually brought in different Asian voice
Mm.
actors for the different people who understood the specific viewpoints of the people that they were speaking for. And as you said, you can absolutely hear the emotion in their voices. So while I am usually one to advocate reading a book, this is one that I would fully advocate uh, listening to the audiobook because the voices lend something to this that I don't think would necessarily get lost if you were reading it, but that I wouldn't have known was missing if I hadn't have heard it, you know?
Yeah, and it's that extra level of flavor.
Yeah. And it uh, it was also really kind of cool because just because they were Asian voice actors doesn't mean all of them like had like a thick accent. Some of them did, but not all of them did, and I really like that in the book the stories aren't written as hi, I'm Asian and here's my story. It was here's the story, and then naturally organically for at some point it gets brought up that they have an Asian background, and it feels very fluid in the way that's done, which I thought was pretty cool because I was just like, I would not have known that that was an Asian speaking until you said their name or specifically noted it because of topics that we have seen ourselves in pandemic situations where because it started in an Asian country, then there's a prejudice against Asian people, that sort of thing. Um, it was done so organically that it allowed you to sink into the character before you made any prejudgments about them, which I thought was incredibly smart.
So I have a question for you. My question is, what do you think about the impact of mass death on the culture in this book, and kind of the culture that like springs up around grief management?
Thanks for letting us know, Alpac. Apparently, you're quiet
Oh,
compared to me.
okay. 1 second.
um,
How?
I will answer while you are sorting that out.
I'll turn you
So
down.
I, as far as the change in culture around grief and the grieving process, I thought it was fairly realistically managed. I don't know exactly when. I know this book is very new, and I don't know what or how much of it was affected by the pandemic in real life.
Let me
I
tell
have to
you.
imagine.
Let me tell you. So this book was published January 2022, and it seems to have been written either during or post 2020.
Okay, so you can tell that there are elements that are uh, most likely at least partially influenced by what we went through in the way that we seek comfort for these things despite the crappy stuff going around. Um, I am not at all surprised that it was treated as like that grief and grieving was commodified. There is a, I thought, there's a humanistic element to it too, even in this like corporate structure of, like and we've been dancing around it, but I have to get into chapter two a little bit, is the connection and these little stories of like how these little things absolutely changed the way that these children were going through their own death and dying process, and in a positive way, like we see with the little boy that our narrator for that chapter connects with, or even the little girl. There's these little elements, and but it's not glorified in any way. I want to say it is
Yeah.
just saying this can have a positive impact, and there are things that are important about this. But here's the toll that it also takes, both on a personal level and a societal level, and how dystopian it is while also being human. And that intersection, I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic. And I thought there was a lot more nuance than I was expecting. Because like when they said that they were building a park for kids to go and die at, I was just like, well, all right, corporate hellscape, here we come. But then you get these really human moments, and you feel the pain and the emotional suffering, but also the little moments of joy that they get as well. And I thought it was really smartly done in a way to say, like, yes, it made it realistic, both on an emotional level and as a like world building level, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that I think the the one that gets me is like the skyscrapers or whatever of like cemeteries.
Yeah,
Um, and how like they've got the eulogy hotels and or the effigy. One second, I think it's
elegy.
elegy, the elegy hotels and stuff like that. Like, and the fact that like currency in America was turned into essentially like Bitcoin, but for like what do you call it, the undertakers, right? Is
Yeah,
uh the they he made mention that like the banks failed and what came in was the rich like death uh
and
economy and stuff like that.
yeah,
And so like between that and like the change in grieving was so like at the start you start seeing like you see like the grief of the father, um, of Clara's father at the start, right? And then you start seeing like that grieving process like change to the point where near the end, they're doing like marches and stuff like that to like remember the fallen, right? I think that was at Baba's funeral. They do the memory march, and it was really interesting, especially because that was something for me at the height of the lockdown for the pandemic that I thought about a lot was like how is this going to affect our society in the long run?
mhm,
As at the time, um, it really felt like one of those things that changes culture, right? To the point where like you start having a holiday, right? I mean, we have pandemics in human history that have changed our culture so much that we have like songs about them and we have holidays and you know what I mean? So like that was the kind of thing I was thinking about at the height of the pandemic, and this book took that and like ran with it, right? And so it was interesting to see how he kind of allowed this epidemic, this plague, kind of shape the world, and how the reactions of humans kind of changes the course of humanity, right?
yeah,
You start seeing this massive economy around death. You start seeing, um, once they overcome the the disease, what happens, right? You don't have as many people dying. That economy starts changing again. And so they stopped using those coins. They started using like yen or I wasn't quite clear on if the digital currency was used in Japan, but in one of the later stories, they were using yen after it was cured. So like I don't know, it was really cool, and it was one of those like not so subtle but background things that made this book like really interesting in my opinion.
yeah. Yeah, it was it was pretty interesting how they touched on how the author touched on so many topics, but kept it human centered at the core of everything. But there was these really cool concepts that just kind of float through the background, you know, and they bring your attention to, like you said, these changes that these uh, you know, major points in human history have on like everyday life. I do believe that they go back to yen or something, but I thought the digital currency was mostly for anybody who lived in and around those those like the Elegy hotels, because they lived and worked in that same place, which is something I know that like there's a lot of people worry that we're headed towards that sort of economy
Sure.
where businesses will, as a part of their pay, will provide housing as well.
Yeah. I thought that there was mention of the digital currency in the second chapter, in the City of Laughter.
It probably was, and it probably does go outside of there, but I didn't think it was like a worldwide thing, was my point. So if
Oh,
they weren't
gotcha.
using it in Japan,
Yeah,
I like in the same way that
that's
like,
fair.
Tesla was going to allow Bitcoin for a while, but many other companies weren't type of thing. And they're because they're related to the death industry, it would make sense that through that industry, that type of coin would be have some value. Um, I thought it was pretty well done to show that there are like stuff like a pandemic has a way of fundamentally shifting things, as you said, and it was kind of fun to follow those threads despite the very dystopian backdrop. you know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it makes sense though if there's something that I think it shows the importance that we place on death and how easy it is for that sort of thing to become a powerful industry if it were ever to happen en masse.
Right.
Um,
So what you got
so,
for me?
uh, you actually took one of the ones that I
Uh-oh.
wanted to talk about. So, like, no, I'm just going through the list in my head. I wasn't prepared enough to write it down this time, but
For shame.
um, um, I think then, was there a particular not storyline, but particular character or character dynamic that stood out for you, um, and why? It doesn't have to be even be positive, but like, was there a particular character or character dynamic that stood out to you?
I don't know why, but the pig son was like a really interesting character dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that one, like, I still think about. I try to think like what happened there, and I don't know. I enjoyed that story. I am not quite sure how I feel about how it ends, but yeah, yeah. So that's
No, that's a really good one, and one that was like kind of it. That was like the periphery of like my list, because of it's a weird foray into the nature of what is consciousness and humanity, where does it stop and where does it begin,
hmm
and it just none of this feels out of place because it has a very anthological feel to it in a lot of ways, but that was probably the one that to me was placed outside of more like it felt like its own like weird storyline on in and of itself, like so it's the most self-contained storyline I think was that one,
yeah,
and it was such a huge concept to put on its own.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
connected through the characters obviously because the scientist who raised him is the dad of the kid, and
yeah.
in chapter 2, and
I
stuff.
I think like in that story, the guy like saying how he'll fall asleep to watching like short videos of his kid, that broke me. That was like I can't. I can't handle this right now. I need to like just go to
Mhm.
bed. You know what I mean? Like it was I had to take that one in sections.
All right. Well, I asked this question to set it up because to me, the most interesting character is our fourth or fifth dimensional
Yeah.
alien character. I, from the very beginning, like I said, with that the bit of the characters that were written clearly by tools that couldn't have existed, um, I knew that figured that was going to play a part, but I figured the way that they set it up, I figured it was like, oh, this is a advanced civilization of humanity that died out,
Sure.
and we are the second iteration type of thing,
Mhm.
and uh, it ended up being aliens. So, um, but that character, I thought it was a really good way of coming in at the end and tying everything together through a character that is beyond our standard view of how time and space work, and kind of gave us an outsider's look from the inside. And the character felt human enough to connect to while also being alien enough to give us perspectives that we wouldn't otherwise think of. And like that specific character coming in and basically having influence throughout, banging your way through history. Um, but but it was a character with biological needs that, and emotional needs, but still above everything and also within it. And it was a really weird experience because I had spent the whole book connecting with any given character because like the way that you did with that father and him watching videos of his son, and I would connect with one character because I've felt like similar heartbreak or similar um, accomplishments or what have you. And then there's this one character that I feel weirdly connected to, but that feels alien at the same time in a way that is very different. What I thought was a really cool way to kind of tie everything together from beginning to end at the very end of it. Again, I don't want to draw too many comparisons, but it's kind of like Interstellar, but instead of it just being himself, it is like this other alien character, which I thought had a bit more nuance to it. But I kind of liked going for that ride with that particular character because I think it lifted me up and out of this book enough that I didn't wallow in it afterwards.
Yeah.
I
Well,
thought it was a bit
it
necessary.
gives you more to think about too. Um like it wasn't until the end that I realized that Clara was her and that that um she was multiple characters in this story and that we meet the daughter in the story and like I just it was such an aha ending that I was just like, oh my god, this like completely took the book from like this is sad to like sci-fi, right? Like, I it went from casual like I don't know fiction, right? It felt like realistic fiction with like minor space exploration to holy shit aliens and they've been among us. And, you know? So,
Yeah, yeah, and I think it was either a setup for if there's a sequel. I hope there's not, but it was either a setup for a sequel or again, I think it was a way to just kind of go back and tie things together so things didn't feel so disparate at the end.
mhm.
That's why I kind of treat it like that's why I think it the only reason why I think it works is because there is kind of that anthology aspect to this, is that it didn't feel like it was necessarily aliens the whole time to me,
Hmm.
but more like it was a little. It felt a little forced. I'll give Alpac Phantom that is a little bit forced to be like higher dimensional alien being, but I thought it was a nice sci-fi way to go through, tie everything together, and again, I think I personally emotionally needed something that was a little bit alien to pull me back up out of this book
Right.
because it draws you in so deep,
Well, what I
and
enjoyed
I
about
don't know another way to do that. That's my point.
yeah, what I enjoyed about that though was that it was like it was it was strung through all the way. It was, she was Claire or Clara. She was who was she? Therese or whatever her name was. Uh Teresa. And and it just, you it's like those movies where it's like, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but for me it was just like, wow, I watched this unfold. I watched this character, uh, and I didn't know, right? And it explained the whole why the crystal was important, and I just started cycling through on the stories again. So that's what I enjoyed about it.
I do want to address, like, in general, what LPAC Phantom said in their longer post here, where they didn't fully understand why it mattered that people were tangentially connected to each other. Um, I think I have an answer to that, but do you have any thoughts on why that was? We've kind of covered my answer to this a little bit, but
Why they were like tangentially connected?
oh, uh, he didn't understand why they tangentially knew each other. So basically, uh, things
Oh,
like the woman who made it, the girlfriend of the
yeah.
dude who was the brother of the was the brother of the guy
I
who
don't.
invented space travel, ended up getting a lottery pass onto
Yeah.
the space
I don't. I
shuttle.
don't think that was. I don't think there was any like alien intent. I think that was author intent
Oh,
because
I
that.
don't think that was alien related. I'm specifically noting what Alpac Phantom
Oh,
said,
sure.
where they didn't understand why it was important. Did you see any importance to that, or did it feel
No,
disconnected as well?
I don't think it was disconnected, but it wasn't like a story importance. It was a writing importance. Um, we've read stories like this on the show in the past, right? Like Travelers. I think it was called The Travelers or Travelers, and it was essentially like we had a bunch of small stories that went
Hmm.
through American history, and every story had some form of connection to a past story or a story that will happen. And
Yeah.
and so it just, I feel like there's a subgenre there, and that writing form was, I think, well used in this story because you could tell a much longer timeline through the life of through the lives of these people, especially when you set up a world event where people's chances of surviving long are low.
Um, I would agree. I was actually going to reference the same book. I think that those connections are partially what keeps this from being an anthology, specifically. Is they are separate stories, but because they have two connections. They have this backdrop of a world ravaged by disease and what that creates going forward, as well as these connected characters. Um, Kind of brings it together a little bit. It makes it a more cohesive story. Um, I I liked that it was kind of subtle like that. And I think it also was meant to show that we aren't as far separated from each other as we might think sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
uh, despite living very, very different lives. From a comedian working at a death carnival to a uh, astrophysicist with a black hole in his forehead. Um, so
that, that was that was so weird to me. That was so weird. I
um,
wish I would have gotten more information about
yeah, and
that.
I would slightly disagree that there weren't clues about this potentially being an alien. The biggest ones are in the beginning, where Clara says that she's always been into the ancient aliens theory stuff
Hmm.
and conspiracy theories and stuff, but it gets kind of waved off as like, well, that's nothing. And then there's little tiny hints here and there, but because there isn't much, it can feel a bit like, oh, aliens, like the I think actually it is that meme from Ancient
Yeah.
Aliens on the
Yeah.
History Channel, like aliens,
Yeah.
aliens. um, uh, I I can see how it could feel like one of those Family Guy cutscenes, a little bit. I slightly disagree to it being that harsh of a cutaway, but that's personal opinion. Honestly, like I can see how it fit because there were these little bits, but I was looking for it from the beginning because that's one of the things that drew me in because I thought we were going to get like a disease that transformed people into like a spacefaring theory spacefaring species or something like that, you know. uh okay, so
Uh-huh.
Elpex said, I'm just reading what Elpex said. Oh, hey, I know that guy, he was the last
Yeah.
character, but like why should I care? I don't think it's meant to necessarily make you care about that
Nope.
relationship. I think it's just to provide some sense of continuity.
Yep.
And I think it's specifically kept in the backdrop the same way that things like the disease are. Like, there are certain things that are kept primarily in the backdrop because that provides a sense of continuity as a means to exploring the whatever relationship or specific dynamic that's going on in the current story.
Yeah.
It makes it feel like the character comes less out of nowhere, you know,
Yep.
like, oh, here's why they're in here is because they're related to this person. um, it's not a story style that is for everybody. We discussed that when we did the Travelers, but I personally enjoyed the way it was done for this one. Honestly, better than the Travelers. uh, but I think it's because the Travelers, um, I think, tried to pull those characters in a little bit too much,
Sure.
you know,
It,
because it made you feel like, oh, well, this person's going to be present throughout all
yeah.
of this, whereas and they weren't, and whereas this book they were meant to move in and out of the story because that was kind of a backdrop thing.
Yeah. I that was something I think was done well was that each story is encapsulated and you really don't need to know that they are connected to other people. If you figure out the connection, then you're like, "Oh, oh, 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 oh." Almost like Easter eggs, right? But really,
Yeah,
it's these encapsulated stories that kind of move through.
yeah. It's kind of has a feel of like Black Mirror or Love, Death, and Robots,
Mm,
where but with where there's like a theme in the background, but there might also be characters. But like, uh, I can see how that would be distracting for some people. I personally
yeah,
don't mind the multi-viewpoint thing. We've actually discussed that, I think, again on the Travelers, where it's definitely not a thing that's for everybody. Some people like that um, single viewpoint book. Although I'd be interested to see what Alpac Phantom thinks about things like Stormlight Archives, where
that's fair.
though it's multiple viewpoints, but there is a more cohesive plot between
Yeah,
them.
there's a much more like Yeah, I think that's a really I mean, you're comparing still apples and oranges there, right? As even
Well,
even though like you've got the viewpoint, the s- the story is told like through those characters in a different way that I can't like verbally express, but I can feel it, right? Like when you
well,
read
and I
these stories, you can feel it.
well, I wanted to use that as kind of like a comparison
Yeah,
specifically to go over, the difference in using a multi-person viewpoint for this kind of um, semi-analogical story writing, and how, like, I guess I think we're kind of divided between chat and us. Like, you and I are okay with that, but without a cohesive plot to necessarily specifically bring these characters together, without, like, because in books like Stormlight Archives, those characters, every one of them is an important character, and you know that they are kind of converging on each other in some
right.
way. And that doesn't happen with this book. It's not as disparate as the Travelers kind of tended to be. So I'm wondering if, like, there is an element that even I notice on some level feels a bit weird, is to have characters introduced only for them to just kind of fade into the uh
Maybe it's a lack of main character because there isn't a main character in these story types. And to be clear, this isn't my jam of writing. I can respect the crap out of it, but like I mean, I I am not eating this book up. If this was a series, I wouldn't go to book 2, you know? But it
mhm.
was still a good book. I just if this was going to be what's in the next book and the next book, I'm not here for it. Um, this kind of writing is not something that I want to keep reading books like this back to back. Um, and I think a lot of it is the lack of a main character. You don't have somebody that'll grow and stuff. You're actually like following the story of events, which feels like the main character. I don't know. I can't
No,
fit a main character in there.
I thought that except for the last chapter, the main character wasn't a character. The main character was humanity itself.
That's fair.
And that
Yeah, the abstract.
if you're looking for like a specific singular character, there isn't one. You're
Right.
absolutely right, and maybe that's what makes it hard for a lot of people to connect with those sorts of books, is when there is no main character. And, like, I totally get that, especially because it feels like things lack a little structure when you don't have a main character or characters
Mhm.
to build things around. And the closest thing we get to a main character is the alien, so it feels really
Right.
weird to have that. I think that might almost more, to me, stand out, now that I know how to verbalize it, stand out more about the alien than her actually being an alien,
Yeah.
is the fact that, like, oh, all of a sudden we have a main character who's been around the whole fucking time.
Exactly.
and
Yep.
and so it's almost like, this was like, if this were a movie, this is the viewpoint of, like, the extras, or the, like,
Yeah.
side characters,
Yep.
like, rather than the viewpoint of the main character. So yeah, I can understand why that would be off-putting to a lot of people, because
Absolutely.
it definitely eschews normal uh archetypes for story writing.
And I think that's the difference between like Stormlight Archives and this, right?
Yeah.
Because like I'm really trying to nail down because you point out a really good point of nuance is like we've got plenty of loved books that we just rave over
Mhm.
that are multi viewpoint. And I think the difference is those multiple viewpoints are continuously used. They're used over and over again, and they become main characters and fully fleshed semi main characters and stuff like that, right? So yeah,
Yeah, or they lend themselves to a very specific plot that ultimately ties itself in with a remaining main character.
yeah,
Uh, the first whole book for Stormlight Archives. Just uh,
Oh, I don't know.
let us know.
I
If you can
think I
clarify
think
which book you're talking about, El Pac-Man, and we might
I
be able to
think
address your
he's
question.
I think he's talking about the book, what we just read, How High We Fly in the Dark, is that
Um,
it's in first person the whole time, and I believe that's correct.
yeah, and that's why I
Hmm.
think it is, and that's why it feels like
Like a
you can't
diary.
invest in any given character as a main character, and why I attributed humanity as that character.
Hmm.
And maybe that's why the author chose to have them connected, is so that when that I transfers, you know why it transferred to that person.
Yeah.
Um, I get it though. It's not for everybody. I enjoy that sort of writing. It's not anything I would want to read a series of, but I think as a
Yeah.
standalone novel, that's something I can get behind. Um,
I can respect the crap out of that though,
and,
Alpac. And I think that doesn't work for me as well. Is not necessarily the first person's perspective, but the multi viewpoint itself not having a main character, I think is what turns me off, and what keeps me reading for these series is that I thoroughly enjoy the hunt for connection, the Easter
mhm.
eggs. Uh, because like I've said many times on this show, my jam is when storylines start to cross. Right? It
Yeah.
doesn't it doesn't matter if it's in comics, in movies, in books. Once storylines that you've kind of followed cross, man, I'm here for it.
Mhm.
And these story this writing style does that often, right? And
But it kind of just casually passes them off
yeah.
rather than, what you're talking about is when these things converge, it is intentional. It is, you can not necessarily see it coming, but when they do converge, you can tell why and how it contributes to the plot. And if one of those character arcs disappears for whatever reason,
Hmm.
it has now contributed to the one who has taken up the mantle.
Yeah.
um, and you understand why that has happened. So yeah, I totally understand that, and I would agree for a series, but for standalone novels, I can enjoy stuff like this.
Yeah.
That said, I do want to ask one quick question
One quick
before we get in.
question. Yeah, and then let's start
Very
wrapping
quick
it up after
question.
that.
So I guess, what was the thing? What was the writing? Oh, sorry. What part of the writing did draw you in the most? Because we've talked about things that we don't like,
Hmm.
but like, what kept you reading this as opposed to say dropping off like A Skittle did?
I hate to say it, but like the show, like the the book club, like I, honestly, like I think I would have given up around where Skittles did. Um, but like I was just kind of, I went through it, and like it I mean, because for me, it was a lot of heavy topics, and it made me honestly face some stuff that I didn't want to face. And to the book's credit, it was cathartic for me at certain points. Um, there was I realized that there was some things that I haven't like fully grieved about. Um, from reading this book, and I that made it hard for me to continue, because it's easier to push away from that than it is to face it head on, and the book constantly reminded me of that. And so I don't know. I think I answered your question and then some.
No. And thank you for that little bit of emotional vulnerability. I know it is tough to read books like that, but honestly, what you found difficult to get through is exactly why I pushed through. I like a book that can emotionally challenge me in ways that I might struggle to do on my own. Force me to ask those questions and to examine them and to have, because it's a lot of work to do that on your own. It really is, and I spend
Hmm.
a lot way more time than I should on that. And to have something else bring it up and have me really focus on those questions while giving me a means to do it outside of myself at least a little bit, I actually am grateful for that opportunity and I try to embrace it. Now, that said, there are times in my life where I might have had to have stopped this. I'm currently not in that sort of place, but I had enough space for it this time, and there are other times that I would have, but there are times where I wouldn't have as well. Um,
Yeah,
I am
I think
curious,
that's
Alpac
fair.
Phantom, when you said that you, uh, I think you're saying that you weren't into it enough to have finished after the pig one. Is Was that just for a lack of interest, or was it the specifically the first person perspective without the main character? Sorry, the first person perspective on the multi viewpoint that you mentioned. If you can clarify for us, that would be awesome. But otherwise, like the thing that stopped, like I said, the thing that stopped that made you want to stop reading is the thing that compelled me to read. Um, I think it is an exercise that is a lot of people avoid more, probably more than they should. To be blindsided by it is a bit rough.
Yeah.
And if you're not in a space to accept that challenge, then I wouldn't recommend it normally.
Yeah, I would say like getting into final impressions, right? I would say that like this book was a really well done book. It wasn't my jam, but I'm not angry for reading it. It certainly won't make it on my least my least hated or my most hated book list at the end of the year, right? But that being said, I would highly recommend a few things. I would recommend that you read up on this book before reading this book, because there's big triggers in here. You're dealing with death of young children. You're dealing with death in general. You're dealing heavily in the grieving process. And if you're not in a good mindset, or or if you know that those are topics that you have a really hard time reading, and you're not ready to like take those on, then this isn't gonna be the book for you probably. This is certainly going to be a book for somebody who like understands that they're ready for something like that. Having been blindsided, right? Because I knew nothing about this book. It was rough. It was rough. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't a good book. This is, in my opinion, and I think it's won some awards. This is an award-winning book. It's just written in a way that is very. It feels like people will award this book. This is a book that people talk about. You know, it's that kind of book. It is not the mainstream sci-fi. This is like a very, I want to say like cultured sci-fi. It this book puts its pinky up when it drinks sci-fi tea. So you know,
uh, I would I would agree. I think this does suit me personally more than I think the average reader. Uh, there are a lot of people I absolutely would not recommend this book to, but there are a few that I think would. I think those that have an appreciation for emotional prose, whether that's in poetry or in um, novels, I think those people who are more inclined to read stuff like that might have a better time with this. Those people who want to take a more uh, yeah, you're right. I don't have the right word for it. I wanted to say intellectual, but yeah, pinky up. It's not like snooty outright, but it is uh, kind of
Refined.
huh?
Refined.
uh, so yeah, there are. I would absolutely recommend it for anybody who likes books that are on the more I guess on the more like literary end of things,
Hmm.
where the prose is a little more highfalutin.
Sure.
I was trying to like, uh, and for those who like sci-fi that has like a somewhat realistic edge to it,
Hmm.
would like this, but absolutely trigger warnings for those dealing with loss, or loss and grief, and that those sorts of things. It is a lot to deal with, and please be in the right headspace before you take this on. Uh,
Yeah.
but this is very much so the kind of book that I could see at least getting talk for awards if it doesn't actually win
Oh yeah.
any, because it is very well written for what it is, but what it is not appealing to everybody.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
Right.
Well, let's see here. Are um our next books are so read by March 25th. We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor, and read by April 29th. Less by Andrew Sean Greer.
And coming up for our next vote, it will be open to. We're going to be doing just like any book is possible, but this is going to be our bring a friend week. That means everybody gets a chance to vote, regardless of Patreon status. So if you want to feel the power of the vote and tell us what to do, bring somebody around, bring your friends, your family, your dog, your cat, anybody who can press a button, and ideally somebody who can pay the $2 a month if they like what they see.
Yep.
Just to bring anybody and everybody. We'll try and put some books on there that have some broad appeal, but generally speaking, we're going to be doing our original formula for those votes that would be coming up. We will decide on the exact date by the time we put the vote up, but it is going to be somewhere around the end of May or potentially
Yep.
beginning of June, because it is a tricky bit of the year for
Tricky month.
everybody.
Yeah.
Tricky bit of the year for everybody. So we will get that sorted out for you. And in the meantime, just start inviting people. If there's any books that you want us to throw on there that you think might have some good general appeal and are in our wheelhouse, send them our way.
Yep. So let's get into the end plugs here. You can check out more information about our show or all the other cool things we do at dmstable.com. Hey, did you know we have a D&D podcast? That's over there. Go check it out. You can also support uh, DM's Table by checking out our Etsy store at dmstable.com/Etsy. That's where you can buy these cool wall signs right here. Um, of course, the voting will be happening at Patreon, patreon.com/ DM's Table. You can hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. We're on Facebook at The DM's Table and on Twitter at DM's Table. Hit us up on those socials if you want to join our Discord group. Our Discord group is a fun, inclusive group, and we talk about all kinds of nerdy stuff. We got a 3D printing uh, channel on there. We got D&D channels. It's a good time. Do, and we covered the books. So I think
Yep.
that's about it.
Yep. Uh, thanks everyone for coming out. It was a rough go of it, but I've already finished our book for next time, and it is, well, I will say, while it does have some similarities to what we just read, and you'll see why when we get to it, it is a much less down in the
Less
it's
dour.
much less of an emotional slog.
Yeah.
It is a lot more lighthearted
Okay.
than this last one. So um,
I look
I don't
forward to
think
it.
there's any serious trigger warnings in this one. There is some questionable stuff that happens for sure, but it's uh, I
Ooh, a
think a
comedy?
lot. Uh,
Ooh.
it has uh, comedic elements for sure.
Okay.
And so no need to fear the next one, folks.
What's your side piece for between this and the Bob verse?
uh you mean my side? Which one? I
Right?
uh well, I actually did just finish Born Standing Up, which was it's not a fiction, it's actually a biography for
Oh,
Steve
okay.
Martin, the comedian. It was surprisingly had a similar prose to the one that we just read. Like, it was a
Okay.
lot more poetic than I was expecting from him, but also knowing his love of wordplay, not that surprising. And you find out eventually that he was apparently like a English lit major for a while.
Oh,
So
okay. Nice.
so studying poetry was like kind of a thing he did for a while, so it makes a little more sense. But anyways, that was fun. Currently, though, I think I am moving on to like I want to try exploring some of the classics. So I also just finished up the Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and I'm moving on to uh, Animal Farm.
Nice. Okay. I am actively reading Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. So I'm working through the Mistborn series. I'm about 2/3 of the way through, maybe 3/4. So pretty excited. That's oh man, just so good, so
Yeah,
good.
I kind of overdosed on Brando Sando for a little while, so I've been like, it's gonna take me. I'm thinking that's gonna be like when summer rolls around, the
Yeah,
kind of thing that I'm going to like, because uh, I actually want to be able to like just sit there and just like read and not read those ones and not have to read them while I'm doing work.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, those are
I,
ones that I like to like imagine as I read because there's so much cool world building in it. But
yeah.
we'll get I'll make my way around. For now, though, I've been having fun going through some slightly different stuff. The
Mhm,
classics are actually kind of fun because like what is it? The Time Machine. It's only
mhm.
like a 3.5 hour
Yeah, they're
audiobook.
so short. Like
There, so
we've
you can get through.
we've been broken by Brandon and all the the epic fantasy writers. Yeah, when you start approaching a book and it's under 10 hours, you're like, "Oh geez, this is short."
That's another cool one. Critical Mass
Critical
by Daniel
Mass?
Suarez.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds
and
good.
anybody, whether it's here during the show or on our socials, always feel free to share what your side piece books are. We
Maybe we'll
won't
throw that
tell.
on. Have we done Freedom Demon and Freedom TM?
We
I
did
think we did
we did
Demon.
Demon.
Okay.
We did
Maybe
Demon.
maybe we'll throw Critical Mass on there cuz I haven't read it and it's not a part of that series. It's just a standalone.
Could be one to throw on there for sure.
I'm
All
going to
right,
toss it on
but we will keep you posted. For now, thanks again everybody for showing up. And oh, it only came out a month ago, but awesome.
there.
Uh,
Nice.
but thanks everybody for coming out, and we'll see you next book. All right.
Excellent. See you next book, guys.